Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, in which a new boss has come to town in the cathedral town of Barchester. There is a new bishop, Dr. Prouty, and he has come along with his domineering wife, Mrs. Prouty, and also his personal chaplain, Obadiah Slope. And they have all sorts of reforming ideas in mind for Barchester. They want to sweep clean. They want to change the way Barchester has been doing worship for hundreds of years. And one of the ways they do that is by Mr. Slope preaching a disastrous sermon at Barchester Cathedral, basically laying out the rules about the new boss in town and solidifying the lines of resistance. Archdeacon Grantley and a whole bunch of other members of the church bureaucracy now are officially aligned against the bishop. They do not want him to have the upper hand in Barchester. Another thing that's laid out in that sermon by Mr. Slope is that the bishop doesn't look kindly on absentee clergy, which until this time had been the absolute norm. For instance, Dr. Vesey Stanhope, a member in good standing of the church bureaucracy, has not set foot in his diocese in 20 years. He's raised his whole family on the shores of Lake Como, drawing a full salary, but letting his functionaries, his own employees and subordinates, do all the work for him. Such clerics are given letters saying, "You had best come home. We don't like this behavior. Until it's all sorted out, you're really needed back here in Barchester." So Dr. Vesey Stanhope comes back home to Barchester with his children in tow. He has 3 children who are, well, Trollope makes it clear they're sociopaths, but they're very different from each other. His daughter Charlotte is cold and calculating, but seems friendly on the surface. They all seem friendly on the surface. His son Bertie, his son and heir, is a weirdo. He has a long, flowing beard, and he wears bright blue, loose-fitting clothing like pajamas, and no one knows what to make of him. And there's also Madeline, his daughter Madeline, who married an Italian man named Neroni. And she goes by the Signora. She calls herself the Signora and lets everybody else do it too. Apparently that Italian man hurt her, abused her, and cost her the use of one of her legs. So she is carried around on a sofa throughout the whole novel. She can't really walk. And she's beautiful. If her Italian husband was responsible for her injury, he left her face alone. She is the most beautiful woman in Barchester. And a spider. She's a trapdoor spider. She is constantly intriguing with men. She likes to make fools of them by making them fall in love with her when she is absolutely not going to fall in love back. She has no emotions. The Stanhopes don't have any emotions. So they can't give any emotions to someone else. Bertie has been being very nice on the surface to, for instance, Eleanor Bold, another beautiful young rich widow in Barchester. So has so has the whole Vesey Stanhope family. They've all been very nice to Eleanor Bold, but only on the surface. They don't feel anything themselves. Well, that's only one of the first things that Trollope tells us about them. And all of these characters, all of the aligned powers on one side of Barchester, the bishop, his wife, his chaplain, the archbishop, all of these people are suddenly gathered together at a country gathering, a country do, put on by 2 of the local gentry. They have a vast, sprawling property, and they invite lots and lots of people from Barchester to come to this event. And Trollope is spreading that event over many chapters to give it its full dramatic due. And the whole event takes place under the shadow of a tragedy that isn't really seen as a tragedy, not on a personal level. The old dean of Barchester, a powerful position. The deanery is a powerful part of the Barchester clerical bureaucracy. The old dean has had a fit of apoplexy, a major stroke, and he cannot survive. But he has not yet died. He is Schrodinger's dean. He is hovering between life and death. But not much longer. This next chapter that we're reading is chapter 38, and the title is The Bishop Breakfasts and the Dean Dies. So the dean's superposition is about to be pierced. His wave function is about to be determined one way or another. So let's see what's going on at the country dinner. People are sitting down to eat now, having milled around on the lawn and played some games. Some of the quality are sitting down to eat. The Bishop of Barchester said grace over the well-spread board in the Ullathorne dining room, and while he did so, the last breath was flying from the Dean of Barchester as he lay in his sick room in the deanery. When the Bishop of Barchester raised his first glass of champagne to his lips, the Deanship of Barchester was a good thing in the gift of the Prime Minister. Is the Parliament gives out these well-moneyed jobs in the church where you get a very good salary, excellent grounds, a beautiful house for nothing, for doing nothing. You know, if you don't want to preach a single word in your pulpit, you don't have to. If you don't ever want to visit the poor, you don't have to. You don't have to do anything. You just get the money. So Parliament dispenses these things. Before the Bishop of Barchester had left the table, the minister of the day was made aware of the fact that at his country seat in Hampshire and already turned over in his mind the names of 5 very respectable aspirants for the preferment. It is at present only necessary to say that Mr. Slope's name was not among the 5. Mr. Slope has been very much hoping for the seat. He's been canvassing for it. He's written to an editor of a newspaper that he knows, written to a politician that he knows. He has, of course, worked hard on the bishop, on Dr. Prouty, to get him to put a word in. He's counting on it, in fact. And we know that he is, but we now know what he doesn't, which is that he wasn't even considered for it. 'Twas merry in the hall when the beards wagged all, and the clerical beards wagged merrily in the hall of Ullathorne that day. It was not till after the last cork had been drawn, the last speech had been made, the last nut cracked, that tidings reached and were whispered about that the poor dean was no more. It was well for the happiness of the clerical beards that this little delay took place, as otherwise decency would have forbidden them to wag at all. But there was one sad man among them that day, Mr. Arabin, who we've met. He's at this party. He is also very much would like to marry Eleanor Bold, but he is still convinced that she holds romantic feelings for Mr. Slope. Nothing could be further from the truth. She's already told her father that. Her father now knows. Baby, stop it. There you go. But Mr. Arabin seems to be the last one to be willing to agree to this, to be willing to see what's obvious and right in front of his face. Mr. Arabin's beard did not wag as it should have done. He had come there hoping the best, striving to think the best about Eleanor, turning over in his mind all the words he remembered to have fallen from her about Mr. Slope, and trying to gain from them a conviction unfavorable to his rival. He had not exactly resolved to come that day to some decisive proof as to the widow's intention, but he had meant, if possible, to recultivate his friendship with Eleanor. And in his present frame of mind, any such recultivation must have ended in a declaration of love. Because we've already been told, Trollope has already told us that they love each other. They can't say it to each other. He had passed the previous night alone in his new parsonage, and it was the first night that he had so passed. It had been dull and somber enough. Mrs. Grantley had been right in saying that a priestess would have been wanting at St. Ewald's. He had sat there alone with his glass before him and then his teapot, thinking about Eleanor Bold. As is usual in such meditations, he did little but blame her for liking Mr. Slope, blame her for not liking him, blame her for cordiality to himself, and blame her for want of cordiality. Blame her for being stubborn, headstrong, and passionate, and yet the more he thought about her, the higher she rose in his affections. If only it should turn out, if only it could be made to turn out, that she had defended Mr. Slope not from love, but on principle, all would be right. That is, of course, the case. That is, of course, the case. That is what Eleanor's all but come out and said to everyone. If such principle in itself would be admirable, lovable, womanly, he felt that he could be pleased to allow Mr. Slope just that much favor. But if... and then Mr. Arabin poked the fire unnecessarily, spoke crossly to his new parlour-maid who came in for the tea things, and threw himself back in his chair, determined to go to sleep. Why had she been so stiff-necked when asked a plain question? She could not but have known in what light he regarded her. Why had she not answered a plain question, and so put an end to his misery? Because the plain question was an insult. Then, instead of going to sleep in his armchair, Mr. Arabin walked about the room as though he had been possessed. Uh-oh. What you doing, baby? What you doing? You going to give the folks from Frieda Yoga? Yes, I bet you are. Oh, we're starting early. Oh, goodness. Oh, stretch those glutes, baby. Oh. Okay, there you go. You got 2 different instances of Frieda Yoga yesterday. I don't think that's going to happen today. Okay. All On the following morning, when he attended Miss Thorne's behest, he was still in somewhat confused state. His first duty had been to converse with Mrs. Clanteram, and that lady had found it impossible to elicit the slightest sympathy from him on the subject of her cloak. Miss Thorne had asked him whether Mrs. Bold was coming with the Grantleys, and the two names of Bold and Grantley together had nearly made him jump from his seat. He was in this state of confused uncertainty, hope, and doubt when he saw Mr. Slope, with his most polished smile, handing Eleanor out of her carriage. He thought of nothing more. He never considered whether the carriage belonged to her or to Mr. Slope, or to anyone else whom they might both be mutually obliged without any concert between themselves. This sight in his present state of mind was quite enough to upset him in his resolves. It was clear as noonday. Had he seen her handed into a carriage by Mr. Slope at the church door with a white veil over her head, the truth could not have been more manifest. He went into the house, and as we have seen, soon found himself walking with Mr. Harding. Shortly afterwards, Eleanor came up, and then he had to leave his companion and either go about alone or find another. While in this state, he was encountered by the Archdeacon. "I wonder," said Dr. Grantley, "if it be true that Mr. Slope and Mrs. Bold came here together. Susan," that's Archdeacon Grantley's wife, says she's almost sure she saw their faces in the same carriage as she got out of her own." Mr. Arabin had nothing for it but to bear his testimony to the correctness of Mrs. Grantley's eyesight. "It is perfectly shameful," said the Archdeacon, "or I should say rather shameless. She was asked here as my guest, and if she be determined to disgrace herself, she should have feeling enough not to do so before my immediate friends. I wonder how that man got himself invited. I wonder whether she had the face to invite him." To this Mr. Arabin could answer nothing, nor did he wish to answer anything. Though he abused Eleanor to himself, he did not choose to abuse her to anyone else, nor was he well pleased to hear anyone else speak ill of her. Dr. Grantley, however, was very angry, and did not spare his sister-in-law. Mr. Arabin, therefore, left him as soon as he could, and wandered back into the house. He had not been there long when the Signora was brought in. For some time he kept himself out of temptation, and merely hovered round her at a distance. But as soon as Mr. Thorne had left her, he yielded himself up to the basilisks, and allowed himself to be made prey of. It is impossible to say how the knowledge had been acquired, but the Signora had a sort of instinctive knowledge that Mr. Arabin was an admirer of Mrs. Bold. Men hunt foxes by the aid of dogs, and are aware that they do so by the strong organ of smell with which the dog is endowed. They do not, however, in the least comprehend how such a sense of smell can work with such acuteness. The organ by which women indistinctly, as it were, know and feel how other women are regarded by men, and how also men are regarded by other women, is equally strong and equally incomprehensible. Certainly couldn't be their brains. It's got to be some sort of organ. At a glance, a word, a motion suffices. By some such acute exercises of her feminine senses, the Signora was aware that Mr. Arabin loved Eleanor Bold, and therefore, by a further exercise of her peculiar feminine propensities, it was quite natural for her to entrap Mr. Arabin into her net. Men can also be manipulative a-holes, Tony. Okay? The work was half done before she came to Ullathorne, and when could she have had a better opportunity of completing it? She had had almost enough of Mr. Slope, though she could not quite resist the fun of driving a very sanctimonious clergyman to madness by a desperate and ruinous passion. Mr. Thorne had fallen too easily to give much pleasure in the chase. His position as a man of wealth might make his allegiance of value, but as a lover he was very second-rate. We may say that she regarded him somewhat as a sportsman does a pheasant. The bird is so easily shot that he would not be worth the shooting were it not for the very respectable appearance he makes in the larder. The Signora would not waste time much in shooting Mr. Thorne, but still he was worth bagging for family uses. But Mr. Arabin was game of another sort. The Signora was herself possessed of quite sufficient intelligence to know that Mr. Arabin was a man of more than usually intellectual. She also knew that as a clergyman he was a much higher stamp than Mr. Slope, and that as a gentleman he was better educated than Mr. Thorne. She would never have attempted to drive Mr. Arabin into ridiculous misery as she did Mr. Slope, nor would she think it possible to dispose of him in 10 minutes as she had done with Mr. Thorne. Such were her reflections about Mr. Arabin. As to Mr. Arabin, it cannot be said that he reflected at all about the Signora. He knew that she was beautiful, and he felt that she was able to charm him. He required charming in his present misery, and therefore he went and stood at the head of her couch. She knew all about it. Such were her peculiar gifts. It was her nature to see that he required charming, and it was her providence to charm him. As the Eastern idler swallows his dose of opium, as the London reprobate swallows his dose of gin, So, with similar desires and for similar reasons, did Mr. Arabin prepare to swallow the charms of the Signora Neroni. "Why aren't you shooting with bows and arrows, Mr. Arabin?" said she, when they were nearly alone together in the drawing-room, "or talking with young ladies in shady bowers, or turning your talents to account in some way? What was a bachelor like you asked here for? Don't you mean to earn your cold chicken and champagne? Were I you, I should be ashamed to be so idle." Mr. Arabin murmured some sort of answer. Though he wished to be charmed, he was hardly yet in a mood to be playful in return. "Why, what ails you, Mr. Arabin? Here you are in your own parish. Miss Thorne tells me that her party is given expressly in your honor, and yet you are the only dull man at it. Your friend Mr. Slope was with me for minutes since, full of life and spirits. Why don't you rival him?" It was not difficult for so an acute an observer as Madeline Neroni to see that she had hit the nail on the head and driven the bolt home. Mr. Arabin winced visibly before her attack, and she knew at once that he was jealous of Mr. Slope. "But I would look on you and Mr. Slope the very antipodes of men," she said. "There is nothing in which you are not each other's reverse of the other, except in belonging to the same profession. And even in that you are so unlike as to perfectly maintain the rule. He is gregarious, you are given to solitude. He is active, you are passive. He works, you think. He likes women, you despise them. He is fond of position and power, and so are you, but for directly different reasons. He loves to be praised, you foolishly abhor it. He will gain his reward, which will be an insipid, useful wife, a comfortable income, and a reputation for sanctimony. You will also gain yours." "Well, and what will they be?" said Mr. Arabin, who knew that he was being flattered, and yet suffered himself to put up with it. "What will be my rewards?" "The heart of some woman whom you will be too austere to own that you love, and the respect of some few friends which you will be too proud to own that you value." "Rich rewards," said he, "but of little worth if they are so treated. Oh, you are not to look for such successes as awaits Mr. Slope. He is born to be a successful man. He suggests to himself an object, and then starts forward with eager intention. Nothing will deter him from his pursuit. He will have no scruples, no fear, no hesitation. His desire to be a bishop with a rising family. The wife will come first, and in due time the apron. You will see all this, and then—" "Well, and then what?" "Then you will begin to wish that you had done the same." Mr. Arabin looked placidly out at the lawn, and resting his shoulder on the head of the sofa, rubbed his chin with his hand. It was a trick he had when he was thinking deeply, and what the Signora said made him think. Was it not all true? Would he not hereafter look back, if not at Mr. Slope, at some others, perhaps not equally gifted with himself, who had risen in the world while he had lagged behind, and then wished that he had done the same? "Is not such the doom of all speculative men of talent?" said she. "Do they not all sit wrapped as you are now, cutting imaginary silken cords with fine edges, while those not so highly tempered sever the everyday Gordian knots of the world's struggles, and win wealth and renown? Steel too highly polished, edges too sharp, do not do for this world's work, Mr. Arabin." Who was this woman who thus read the secrets of his heart, and re-uttered to him the unwelcome bodings of his own soul? He looked full into her face when she had done speaking, and said, "Am I one of those foolish blades, too sharp and too fine to do a useful day's work?" "Why do you let the Slopes of the world outdistance you?" said she. "Is not the blood of your veins as warm as his? Does not your pulse beat as fast? Has not God made you a man, and intended you to do a man's work? Yes, and to make a man's wages also?" Mr. Arabin sat ruminating and rubbing his face, and wondering why these things were said to him, but he replied nothing. The Signora went on. "The greatest mistake any man ever made is to suppose that the good things of the world are not worth the winning. And it is a mistake so opposed to religion which you preach. Why does God permit his bishops, one after another, to have their 5,000s or 10,000s a year, if such wealth is a bad thing and not worth having? Why are beautiful things given to us, and luxuries and pleasant enjoyments, if they not be intended to be used? They must be meant for someone, and what is good for a layman cannot surely be bad for a clerk. You try to despise these good things, but you only try. You don't succeed." "Don't I?" said Mr. Arabin, still musing, not knowing what he said. "I ask you the question, then. Do you succeed?" Mr. Arabin looked at her piteously. It seemed to him as though he were being interrogated by some inner spirit of his own, to whom he could not refuse an answer, and to whom he did not dare to give a false reply. "Come, Mr. Arabin, confess. Do you succeed? Is money so contemptible? Is worldly power so worthless? Is feminine beauty a trifle to be slightly regarded by a wise man?" "Feminine beauty? said he, gazing into her face as though all the feminine beauty in the world were concentrated there. Why do you say I do not regard it? If you look at me like that, Mr. Abbott, I shall alter my opinion. Or I should do so, were I not, of course, aware that I have no beauty of my own worth regarding. The gentleman blushed crimson, but the lady did not blush at all. A slightly increased color animated her face, just so much as to give her an air of special interest. She expected a compliment from her admirer, but she was rather grateful than otherwise by finding that he did not pay it to her. Mr. Slope and Thorne and Brown and Jones and Robinson, they all paid her compliments. She was rather in hopes that she would be ultimately succeed in Mr. Arabin to abuse her. But your gaze, said she, is one of wonder and not of admiration. You wonder at my audacity in asking you such questions about yourself. Well, I do, rather. Nevertheless, I expect an answer, Mr. Arabin. Why were women made beautiful if men are not to regard them? But men do regard them. But why not you? You are begging the question, Madame Neroni. I am sure I shall beg nothing, Mr. Arabin, which you will not grant, and I do beg for an answer. Do you not, as a rule, think women below your notice as companions? Let us see, there is the widow Bold looking round at you from her chair this minute. What would you say to her as a companion for life? Mr. Arabin, rising from his position, leaned over the sofa and looked through the drawing-room door to the place where Eleanor was seated between Bertie Stanhope and Mr. Slope. She at once caught his glance and averted her own. She was not pleasantly placed in her present position. Mr. Slope was doing his best to attract her attention, and she was striving to prevent his doing so by talking to Mr. Stanhope, while her mind was intently fixed on Mr. Arabin and Madame Neroni. Bertie Stanhope endeavored to take advantage of her favors, but he was thinking more of the manner in which he would by and by throw himself at her feet than of amusing her in the present moment. There, said the signora. She was stretching her beautiful neck to look at you, and now you have disturbed her. Well, I declare, I believe I am wrong about you. I believe that you do think Mrs. Bold has a charming woman. Your looks seem to say so, and by her looks I should say that she is jealous of me. Come, Mr. Arabin, confide in me, and if it is so, I'll do all in my power to make up the match. It is needless to say that the signora was not very sincere in her offer. She was never sincere on such subjects. She never expected others to be, nor did she expect others to think her so. Such matters were her playthings, her billiard table, her hounds and hunters, her waltzes and polkas, her picnics and summer-day excursions. She had little else to amuse her, and therefore played at love-making in all its forms. She was now playing at it with Mr. Arabin, and did not at all expect the earnestness and truth of his answer. All in your power would be nothing, said he, for Mrs. Bold, I imagine, is already engaged to another. Then you own your own impeachment yourself. You cross-question me rather unfairly, he replied, and I do not know why I answer you at all. Mrs. Bold is a very beautiful woman, as intelligent as beautiful. It is impossible to know her without admiring her. So you think the widow a very beautiful woman? Indeed I do. And one that would grace the parsonage of St. Ewald's? One that would grace any man's house. And you really have the effrontery to tell me this, to tell me, who, as you very well know, set up herself as a beauty, who am at this very moment taking such an interest in your affairs, you really have the effrontery to tell me that Mrs. Bold is the most beautiful woman you know? I did not say so, said Mr. Arabin. You are more beautiful. Ah, come now, that is something like. I thought you could not be so unfeeling. You are more beautiful, perhaps more clever. Thank you, Mr. Arabin. I knew you and I should be friends. But not a word further. I will not hear a word further. If you talk till midnight, you cannot improve what you have said. But, Madame Neroni, Mrs. Bold, I will not hear a word about Mrs. Bold. Dread thoughts of strychnine did cross my brain, but she is welcome to second place. Her place? I won't hear anything about her or her place. I am satisfied, and that is enough. But, Mr. Arabin, I am dying with hunger. Beautiful and clever as I am, you know I cannot go to my food, yet you do not bring it to me. This, at any rate, was so true as to make it necessary that Mr. Arabin should act upon it, and he accordingly went into the dining-room and supplied the signora's wants. And yourself? Said she. Oh, I am not hungry. I never eat at this hour. Come, Mr. Arabin, don't let love interfere with your appetite. It never does so with mine. Give me half a glass more champagne, and then go to the table. Mrs. Bold will do me an injury if you stay talking to me any longer. Mr. Arabin did as he was bid. He took her plate and glass from her, and going into the dining-room, helped himself to a sandwich from the crowded table and began munching it in a corner. As he was doing so, Miss Thorne, who had hardly sat down for a moment, came into the room, and seeing him standing, was greatly distressed. "Oh, my dear Mr. Arabin, you have never sat down yet. I'm so distressed. You of all men, too," because she gave this party for him. Mr. Arabin assured her that he had only just come into the room. "This is the very reason why you should lose no more time. Come, I'll make room for you." "Thank you, dear," she said, seeing Mrs. Bold was making an attempt to move from her chair, "but I would not for worlds see you stir, for all the ladies would think it necessary to follow. But perhaps if Mr. Stanhope has done, just for a minute, Mr. Stanhope, till I can get another chair." And so Bertie had to rise to make way for his rival. This he did, as he did everything, with an air of good-humored pleasantry which made it impossible for Mr. Arabin to refuse the proffered seat. "His bishopric let another take," said Bertie. Quoting from the Bible. I don't know that Bertie would know the Bible, but the quotation being certainly not very appropriate, either for the occasion or the person spoken to. "I have eaten, and am satisfied, Mr. Arabin. Pray take my chair. I wish for your sake that it really was a bishop's seat." Mr. Arabin did sit down, and as he did so, Mrs. Bold got up as though to follow her neighbor. Pray, don't move," said Miss Thorne, almost forcing Eleanor back into her chair. "Mr. Stanhope is not going to leave us. He will stand behind you like a true knight as he is. And now that I think about it, Mr. Arabin, let me introduce you to Mr. Slope. Mr. Slope, Mr. Arabin. Because I've never met. We're all this way into the book. These two have never met." And the two gentlemen bowed stiffly to each other across the lady whom they both intended to marry, while the other gentleman, who also intended to marry her, stood behind, watching them. The two had never met each other before, and the present was certainly not a good opportunity to make cordial conversation, even if cordial conversation between them had been possible. As it was, the whole four who formed the party seemed as though their tongues were tied. Mr. Slope, who was wide awake to what he hoped was his coming opportunity, was not much concerned in the interests of the moment. His wish was to see Eleanor move, that he might pursue her. Bertie was not exactly in the same frame of mind. The evil day was near enough. There was no reason why he should precipitate it. He had made up his mind to marry Eleanor Bold if he could, and was resolved today to make the first preliminary steps towards doing so. But there was a time enough before him. He was not going to make an offer of marriage over the tablecloth. Having thus good-naturedly made way for Mr. Arabin, he was willing also to let him talk to the future Mrs. Stanhope as long as they remained in their present position. Mr. Arabin, having bowed to Mr. Slope, began eating his food without saying a word further. He was full of thought, and though he ate, he did so unconsciously. But poor Eleanor was the most to be pitied. The only friend on whom she thought she could rely was Bertie Stanhope, and he, it seemed, was determined to desert her. Mr. Arabin did not attempt to address her. She said a few words of reply to some remarks from Mr. Slope, and then, feeling the situation too much for her, started from her chair in spite of Miss Thorne, and hurried from the room. Mr. Slope followed her, and young Stanhope lost the occasion. Madeline Neroni, when she was left alone, could not help pondering much on the singular interview she had had with this singular man. Not a word that she had spoken to him had been intended by her to be received as true, and yet he had answered her in the very spirit of truth. He had done so, and she had been aware that he had done so. She had wormed from him his secret, and he, debarred as it seemed from a man's usual privilege of lying, had innocently laid bare his whole soul to her. He loved Eleanor Bold, but Eleanor was not in his eyes so beautiful as herself. He would fain have asked Eleanor for his wife, but yet he acknowledged that she was the less gifted of the two. The man had literally been unable to falsify his thoughts when questioned, and had been compelled to be true despite himself, even when truth must have been so disagreeable to him. She doesn't know what this is like. She's never met someone like this before. This teacher of men, this Oxford pundit, this double-distilled quintessence of university perfection, this writer of religious treatises, this speaker of ecclesiastical speeches, had been like a little child in her hands. She had turned him inside out and read his very heart as she might have done that of a young girl. She could not but despise him for his facile openness, and yet she liked him for it too. It was a novelty to her, a new trait in a man's character. She felt also that she could never so completely make a fool of him as she did of the Slopes and the Thorns of the world. She felt that she could never induce Mr. Arabin to make protestations to her that were not true, or to listen to nonsense that was mere nonsense. It was quite clear that Mr. Arabin was heartily in love with Mrs. Bold, and the Signora, with her very unwanted good nature, began to turn it over in her mind whether she could do him a good turn. Of course, Bertie must have the first chance. It was an understood family arrangement that her brother was, if possible, to marry the widow Bold. Madeline knew too well his necessities and what was due to her sister to interfere with so excellent a plan, as long as it might be feasible, but she had strong suspicion that it was not feasible. She did not think it likely that Mrs. Bold would accept a man in her brother's position, and she had frequently said so to her sister. She was inclined to believe that Mr. Slope had more chance of success, and with her it would be a labor of love to rob Mr. Slope of his wife. And so the Signora resolved, should Bertie fail, to do a good-natured act for once in her life and give up Mr. Arabin to the woman whom he loved. That is chapter 38, which has a twist at the beginning and a twist at the end. The twist at the beginning is that the dean has died. So the position is now going to go to someone, and it's not going to be Mr. Slope. So we know that, and he doesn't. And the twist at the end is that Madeline Neroni, despite caring nothing for anyone, has sort of made up her mind to help Mr. Arabin, to help smooth things between Mr. Arabin and Eleanor Bold. A kind of a weird thing for Vesey Stanhope to do. What will come of it, we will have to wait and see. I think you can see what Trollope is orchestrating first. Mr. Slope and Eleanor Bold are alone. They have both left the room. They are probably out on the lawn. This is Mr. Slope's big opportunity. He has already lost one thing he's absolutely sure of. He has lost the deanery. He doesn't know that he has, but he has. And there's another thing that he's also lost that he's kind of quasi-counting on, and that is his position in the bishop's household. I can't yell loud enough to overcome it. He's lost his position in the bishop's household. We already know that Mrs. Proudie has already got the bishop to agree that he has to go. That if it comes down to the two of them, it's going to be her. She's the one who's going to win in her own household. So, although Obadiah Slope doesn't know it, the tripod on which he's resting his future, his control of the bishop, his chance at getting the deanery, and his chance of marrying a wealthy, beautiful widow for the money, has been reduced to just one thing. And we know, as readers, what he doesn't know, which is that he has no chance of any of those things. He is not going to be considered for the deanery. He's out of the bishop's palace. And we know, because Trollope has told us, that Eleanor Bold has no more thought of marrying him than she does a toad in the road. But first, they have to have their scene together. I imagine that will be coming up. So we will keep going, despite the Indy 500 in the background. I want to reassure the soft-hearted among you, as I do every time. I know you hear 10 incredibly loud sirens in every single one of my videos, but I want to stress to you there is no emergency. There is no, these vehicles are not responding to an emergency. They're running the sirens in order to dispense with a red light. That's all. That's all. It could get them fired. It is illegal, but that is the only reason. There couldn't be emergencies for 50 loud sirens every hour, because there wouldn't be any people left in Massachusetts. That would well have exceeded the population of Massachusetts in the first year. But anyway, just to apologize, because it came after 30 minutes of reading. I'm not going to redo it. But so that's where we stand now. The party is still going on. We've had our sports. We've done our quintain. We've had a little food. The dean has died. And now things are really coming to a head. We even had a scene in which our weird quartet, the three men who dream of marrying Eleanor Bold, are all in the same grouping together. So we'll see what comes from that next time. I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.